Kitty and Lydia approach Longbourn and run the rest of the way into the house.
Lizzie! Jane!
Kitty and Lydia enter as Jane and Elizabeth appear within.
What do you think? Mr. Collins has made an offer of marriage to Charlotte Lucas.
She's accepted him.
Charlotte? Engaged to Mr. Collins? Impossible.
Later, Mr. Collins talks to Sir William Lucas while Elizabeth takes tea with Charlotte.
The fireplace in the great room at Rosings would be much larger than that. A fireplace of truly prodigious dimensions.
But why should you be surprised, my dear Lizzie? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion because he was not so happy as to succeed with you?
Charlotte, I didn't mean... I was surprised. But Charlotte, if Mr. Collins has been so fortunate as to secure your affections, I'm delighted for you both.
I see what you're feeling. I'm not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home and, considering Mr. Collins' character and situation in life, I'm convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state.
My dear Charlotte.
Mr. Collins takes Charlotte's hand when he and Sir William come over.
Cousin Elizabeth, you see before you the happiest of men.
Mr. Collins smiles ridiculously.
Oh.
Later, at Longbourn, Elizabeth paces. Jane sits on the couch sewing.
Jane, it was such a humiliating spectacle. She knows she's marrying one of the stupidest men in England. I never believed her capable of that.
Well, Lizzie, you do not make allowances for differences of situation and temper. Our cousin Mr. Collins is not the cleverest of men, perhaps, but he is respectable. He is not vicious. And as far as fortune goes, it is an eligible match.
Very eligible? You would never think of marrying a man like that, simply to secure your own comfort.
No, but Lizzie, not everyone is the same.
Dear Jane, I doubt that you will have to make a choice between marrying for love and marrying for more material considerations.
Though you may, perhaps.
Hill enters with a letter and a smile.
This came just now from Netherfield, ma'am.
Thank you. It is from Caroline Bingley. She writes that the whole party will have left Netherfield by now for London and without any intention of coming back again.
My brother Charles at first thought that the business which takes him to London might be concluded in a few days, but we are certain that this cannot be so. I am convinced that when Charles gets to town, he will be in no hurry to leave it again. I do not pretend to regret anything I shall leave in Hertfordshire, my dearest friend, except your society. Mr. Darcy, of course, is impatient to see his sister, and to confess the truth, I am scarcely less eager to meet her again, from the hope I dare to entertain of her being hereafter my sister. Am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging in the hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many?
Is it not clear enough? Caroline Bingley is convinced her brother is indifferent to me, and she means most kindly to put me on my guard. Oh, Lizzie, can there be any other opinion on this subject?
Well, yes, there can. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you, and she wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She hopes to keep him in town and persuade you that he doesn't care about you. Indeed, Jane, you ought to believe me. No one who has seen you and Bingley together can doubt his affection.
I cannot believe Caroline is capable of wilful deceit. All I can hope for is, in this case, that she is deceived herself.
Oh, hell! Believe her to be deceived by all means. But she can hardly convince a man so much in love that he is in love with someone else instead. If Bingley is not back by your side and dining at Longbourn within 2 weeks, I should be very much surprised.
Elizabeth smiles at Jane. Jane smiles back uncertainly. Later, Kitty, Lydia and Elizabeth walk into the village.
I don't envy Charlotte Lucas in the slightest. Fancy wanting to marry a clergyman.
He'll be reading to her from Foley's sermons every night.
Before they go to bed. Oh, look at that hideous cloth. It would do very well for Mary, don't you think?
Oh, look, there's Denny and Carter. And Wickham.
I suppose you'll keep Wickham all to yourself again, Lizzie?
Well, of course she will. She is violently in love with him.
For heaven's sake, lower your voice.
Good afternoon to you, ladies. What a fortunate meeting, for we were about to walk towards Longbourn in search of you.
And we came into town in search of you.
Lydia takes Denny's hand while Carter takes Kitty's. Wickham is left behind with Elizabeth. They smile at each other and walk on.
We were hoping we would see you at the Netherfield ball.
I was very sorry indeed to lose the pleasure of dancing with you there. But fate, it would seem... No. With you, I must be entirely open. I decided that it would be wrong for me to be there. I found, as time drew near, that I'd better not meet with Mr. Darcy, seeing as it might arise unpleasant to more than myself.
I do understand, and I admire your forbearance. Not that it would give me a moment's concern to see Mr. Darcy publicly set down, but in Mr. Bingley's house, it would grieve me to see him embarrassed and discomfited.
And through him, your sister.
Yes.
I hear your cousin, Mr. Collins, is engaged to be married?
Yes, to my good friend, Charlotte Lucas.
I had thought that his intentions tended in another direction.
Perhaps they did, but they took a little turn to everybody's satisfaction.
And relief.
I hope that you will stay and take tea with us. I should like to introduce you to Mother and Father.
Thank you.
Later, Wickham, Denny, Carter and the Bennets exit the front door. We hear Mrs. Bennet talk to Lieutenant Denny amongst the clamour of their leaving.
Oh, Mr. Denny! But you know, I always had a soft spot for...
Elizabeth and Wickham smile at each other. The officers bow and walk off, while the Bennets head back inside, but Lydia runs to the officers.
Denny!
Denny turns around, and Lydia whispers something to him that makes him laugh. Denny gives a little bow, and Lydia giggles as she returns to the house. The officers continue walking. Mr. Bennet and Mary read, and Jane sews, as Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, Kitty and Lydia enter.
Ah, Mr. Wickham, and George Wickham is such a charming young man, is he not, my dear?
What? Oh, indeed. Indeed he is. It was very good of him to entertain us so eloquently with stories about his misfortunes. With such narratives to hand, who would read novels?
But I believe he's truly been treated contemptibly by Mr. Darcy, Father.
Mrs. Bennet nods enthusiastically, whilst Mr. Bennet regards Elizabeth.
I dare say he has, Lizzie. Though Darcy may turn out to be no more of a black-hearted villain than your average rich man who's used to his own way.
It behooves us all to take very careful thought before pronouncing an adverse judgment on any of our fellow men.
Oh, Lord.
Well, I feel sorry for poor Mr. Wickham, and so becoming in his regimentals. Oh, I remember a time when I liked a red coat myself well enough, and I still do in my heart. And there's no need to smile like that, Miss Lizzie. And though Mr. Wickham has taken a fancy to you, I'm sure you've done nothing to deserve it after your dealings with Mr. Collins. Well, it is all in vain. It will all come to nothing. Oh, and the poor young man, if only he had 5,000 or 6,000 a year, I would be happy to see him married to any one of the girls. But nothing turns out the way it should. And now Mr. Bingley, of whom we all had such expectations, is gone forever.
What? I have heard again from Caroline Bingley. It is now quite definite that they will stay in town for the whole winter.
I cannot believe it.
It is true.
Come now, Jane, take comfort. Next to being married, a girl likes to be passed in love now and then. It's your turn to come, Lizzie. You can hardly bear to be long outdone by Jane. Well, here there are enough officers in Meryton to disappoint all the young ladies in the country. Let Wickham be your man. He's a pleasant fellow. He'd jilt you creditably.
Thank you, sir, but a less agreeable man would satisfy me. We must not all expect Jane's good fortune.
Jane gets up and walks to the door.
True. It's a comfort to think that whatever of that kind may befall you, you have an affectionate mother who will always make the most of it.
Elizabeth watches Jane leave sadly and rises to follow her.
Oh, I do not know what will become of us all. Indeed, I do not. And I cannot bear to think of Charlotte Lucas being mistress of this house, that I shall be forced to make way for her and live her to see her take my place in it.
My dear, do not give way to such gloomy thoughts. Let us hope for better things. Let us flatter ourselves that I might outlive you.
As the door closes behind Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet begins to cry. Jane is washing her hands in her nightgown, while Elizabeth sits on her bed.
You mustn't be anxious for me, Lizzie. He will be forgot, and we shall be as we were before. But I may remember him as the most amiable man of my acquaintance, and that is all. I have nothing to either hope or fear, and nothing to reproach him with. At least I have not had that pain.
Oh, my dear Jane, you are too good. Your sweetness and disinterestedness are truly angelic.
Don't tease me, Lizzie.
Indeed, I do not tease you. There are few people whom I really love, and even fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it. Jane, what if you were to go to town? I'm sure Aunt and Uncle Gardner would be very happy to take you back to Gracechurch Street with them after Christmas.
And why would you have me go to London, Lizzie?
Oh, a reason. A change of scene and society.
carriage rides up to Longbourn. The family comes out to meet it.
Why, you are so late. I feared your coach had overset itself, or you'd been attacked by robbers.
Nonsense. We have made very good time. How do you do, Fanny?
Oh, very ill, Edward, very ill. No one knows what I suffer with my poor nerves. But then, I never complain.
Aye, well, I suppose that's a nice way to go about it, Fanny. Oh, very good, very good.
Oh, get yourself in, for you've barely time a change of clothes. We are bidden to the village this evening. Lord knows I have no desire to be always going here and there at night. I should much rather sit at home and rest my poor nerves.
Mary plays the piano softly. Jane and Charlotte walk across the room while Mrs. Phillips, Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Gardner sit on a couch together.
Oh, my poor Jane. But I'd not have you think I blame poor Jane at all.
Jane sits rather quietly with Charlotte.
Who could blame poor Jane for the matter? She is the dearest girl in the world.
I was telling our dear sister, Mrs. Gardner, well, she did her best.
Oh, she would have got Bingley if she could.
She would. She did her best. Well, nobody could do any more than that. Oh, but sister, when I think about Lizzie.
Oh, it must be very hard, sister.
It is very hard to think. She could have been Mr. Collins's wife by now.
That would have given you such comfort.
Oh, and those Lucases are such awful people indeed. They are all for what they can get. However, your coming at this time is the greatest of comforts, and we are very pleased for what you tell us about the latest fashions for long sleeves.
Mrs. Bennet indicates Mrs. Gardner's dress, but turns cold and gets up and walks away with Mrs. Phillips when Elizabeth and Wickham approach.
May I present Mr. Wickham to you, Aunt?
Wickham bows.
I understand you come from Derbyshire, Mr. Wickham.
Indeed I do, ma'am. Do you know the country?
Oh, very well. I spent some of the happiest years of my life at Lambton.
But that is not 5 miles from where I grew up, at Pemberley.
Pemberley? Oh, surely Pemberley is the most handsome house in Derbyshire, and consequently in the whole world.
I see you take my view of things, ma'am. And are you acquainted with the family?
Oh, not at all.
I had the fortune to be the protégé of old Mr. Darcy. He was the very best of men, Mrs. Gardner. I wish you could have known him.
And a 4 on yours, and I'm out. Oh, Lord. I've won again. Oh, let's have some dancing now. I long for a dance. Mary, play Grimstock.
Mary looks up indignantly but stands up and finds the music. Elizabeth and Wickham head for the dance floor. 3 pairs line up and the dance begins. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Phillips and Sir William watch. Sir William claps his hands.
Capital, capital, fine girls, are they not? I think they would grace the court of St. James itself, but let us not forget the younger Miss Bennets.
Aye, they have arms and legs enough between them, and are 3 of the silliest girls in England.
They all look at him. The dancing continues. Mrs. Gardner looks over at a quiet Jane. Later, Wickham dances with an unknown young woman. Elizabeth watches the dancing with Charlotte.
And when do you go to Kent?
We shall spend the wedding night at Lucas Lodge and then travel to Hunsford on Friday.
Charlotte suddenly turns and takes Elizabeth's hand, a little scared and desperate.
You will write to me, Lizzie. I believe I'm not likely to leave Kent for some time. I shall depend on hearing from you very often.
And that you certainly shall.
My father and Maria are to come up to me in March. Lizzie, will you promise to be one of the party? Indeed, you will be as welcome as either of them.
Well, then how could I refuse? But I'll only come if you guarantee me a glimpse of the famous chimney piece at Rosings Park.
That I think you could scarcely avoid even if you wished to.
Charlotte? Have you asked her, Charlotte? Is she to come to Hunsford with us?
Yes.
Oh, good. I shall be half so frightened of Lady Catherine if you are with us, Lizzie.
Maria turns to look at the woman dancing with Wickham.
Who is that girl dancing with Mr. Wickham?
Her name is Mary King. She's come to stay with her uncle in Narrator.
She's not very pretty, is she?
Beauty's not the only virtue, Maria. She's just inherited a fortune of £10,000, I understand.
Now that is a definite virtue.
Longbourn, we see the family through the snowy, frosted windows. Everyone is wrapped up in blankets.
It is very hard. I might feel sorry for Lizzie. Well, though she endured little to deserve it.
For Mr. Wickham to pursue Mary King all the way to Barnet just for her £10,000.
I wish someone would die and leave me £10,000. Then all the officers would be violently in love with me.
I'm sure they would, Kitty, my dear. I'm sure they would.
Did you think her pretty, Mamma?
No, indeed. She has nothing to any of you.
A little short, freckled thing. Poor Wickham, how he must be suffering.
Elizabeth sits on her window seat, reading a letter from Jane.
January the 12th. My dearest Lizzie, here we continue at Gracechurch Street to be quiet and comfortable, and my aunt and uncle could not be kinder or more attentive. All I lack here, dear Lizzie, is you to make me laugh at myself. You will remember that 3 weeks ago, when our aunt was going into that part of town, I took the opportunity of calling on Miss Bingley in Grosvenor Street. I was very eager to see Caroline again, and I thought that she was glad to see me, though a little out of spirits. She reproached me for giving her no notice on my coming to London, and I thought it very strange that both my letters should have gone astray.
Very strange indeed.
My visit was not long, but they gave me every promise of calling at Gracechurch Street in a day or two. I waited at home every morning for 3 weeks, and at length today she came. I know, my dear Lizzie, you will be incapable of triumphing at my expense, when I confess I have been entirely deceived in Miss Bingley's regard for me. She made it very evident that she took no pleasure in seeing me. When I asked after her brother, she made it clear that he knows of my being in town, but is much engaged in present with Mr. Darcy and his sister. I must conclude then that Mr. Bingley now no longer cares for me.
Elizabeth walks in the country towards Longbourn in the spring. Lydia runs out to Elizabeth.
Lizzie, come quick!
Lydia takes Elizabeth's hand and leads her inside.
Denny and Carter are here, and guess who else? Wickham!
Later, Elizabeth and Wickham walk together.
I heard that you are going into Kent. I felt that I could not let you go without calling to see you once.
I'm very glad you did. I've missed our conversations. I hear I'm to congratulate you on your betrothal to Miss King.
I think you must despise me.
Oh, indeed I do not, believe me. I understand, as my younger sisters are not yet able to, that handsome men must have something to live on, as well as the plain ones.
Miss Bennet, I would wish you to believe me that had circumstances been different.
Had old Mr. Darcy never had a son, yes. But life is full of these trials, as my sister Mary reminds us daily. I sincerely wish you every happiness in the world.
You are very forbearing.
But I flatter myself I am. I think Jane would be quite proud of me.
I hope you and I at least will always be good friends.
I'm sure we shall, Mr. Wickham.
Commotion is distracting Mr. Bennet from his reading as Elizabeth is preparing to leave.
Well, Lizzie, on pleasure bent again. Never a thought of what your poor parents will suffer in your absence.
It is a pleasure I could well forego, father, as I think you know. But I shall be happy to see Charlotte again.
And what of your cousin, Mr. Collins? What of the famous Lady Catherine de Bourgh herself? As a connoisseur of human folly, I should have thought you impatient to be savouring those delights.
Oh, some delights, I believe, sir. A little goes a long way.
Yes. Well, think of me, Lizzie. Till you or your sister Jane return, I shall not hear 2 words of sense spoken together. You'll be missed very much, my dear.
Mr. Bennet holds out his hand, and Elizabeth takes it and kisses it.
Very well, very well. Go on now. Get along with you.
Mr. Bennet opens his book again and gives a little smile as Elizabeth leaves. Maria, Sir William and Elizabeth ride in a carriage towards Hunsford.
My Maria, all that land to the left of us belongs to Rosings Park.
All of it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Lady Catherine must be very rich indeed.
I believe so. I believe so. She has many favours in her gift. Your sister has made a fortunate alliance. Yes, well, I believe the next turn takes us on to Hunsford.
The carriage passes through a gate to a house where Mr. and Mrs. come out to meet them.
Sir William, Maria, Cousin Elizabeth, I am truly honoured to be able to welcome you to my humble abode. My dear sir.
My dear Mr. Collins.
I am deeply grateful to be able to make a happy welcome to the parsonage, which I would not be in the position to procure if not for the generosity of her ladyship.
Elizabeth moves toward Charlotte and they kiss one another on the cheek.
I am happy to see you, Elizabeth.
And I you.
Later, Mr. Collins gives them a tour of his home.
The staircase, I flatter myself, is eminently suitable for a clergyman in my position, being neither too shallow nor too steep.
As serviceable a staircase as I've ever seen, sir. Now, at St. James's Court.
Though it is nothing, of course, to the staircases you see at Rosings. I say staircases because there are several, and each in its own way very fine. And here, if you will permit me, Cousin Elizabeth, this will be your bedchamber while you're with us, and I trust you will find it comfortable and convenient.
Indeed, it is a very pleasant room.
Observe the closet, Cousin Elizabeth. What do you say to that?
Well,
is it not the very essence of practicality and convenience? Lady Catherine de Bourgh herself was kind enough to suggest that these shelves be fitted exactly as you see them there.
Shelves in the closet? A happy thought indeed.
Oh, she is kindness itself. Nothing is too small to be beneath her notice, is it not, my dear?
She is a very attentive neighbour.
We dine at Rosings Park twice every week and are never allowed to walk home.
Well, that is generosity itself, is it not?
Now, her ladyship's carriage is regularly ordered for us. I should say one of her ladyship's carriages, for she has several. And now, Sir William, you were kind enough to express a wish to see my gardens?
Mr. Collins, Sir William and Maria exit, leaving Elizabeth and Charlotte alone. Later, Charlotte and Elizabeth enter the parlour and look out of the windows at the gardens.
Mr. Collins tends the gardens himself and spends a good part of every day in them.
The exercise must be beneficial.
Well, yes. I encourage him to be in his garden as much as possible, and then he has to walk to Rosings nearly every day.
So often? Is that necessary?
Perhaps not, but I confess I encourage him in that as well.
Walking is very beneficial exercise.
Oh, indeed it is. And when he is in the house, he's mostly in his book room, which affords a good view of the road whenever Lady Catherine's carriage should drive by.
And you prefer to sit in the parlour?
Yes. So it often happens that a whole day passes in which we have not spent more than a few minutes in each other's company.
I see.
I find that I can bear the solitude very cheerfully. I find myself quite content with my situation, Lizzie.
As Elizabeth reads in her guest room, commotion breaks out in the house.
Charlotte, my dear, come quickly.
What is it, my dear?
Lizzie! Lizzie! Come quickly! Come into the dining room, for there is such a sight to be seen.
Elizabeth smiles calmly and follows Maria to the window.
Look, Lizzie! Look!
Is this all? I expected at least that the pigs had gotten into the garden. It is nothing but Lady Catherine and her daughter.
Elizabeth and Maria see the open carriage with red-coated footmen and two women sitting in it talking to Mr. and Mrs. Collins.
No, Lizzie. That's old Mrs. Jenkinson, not Lady Catherine. And with her is Miss Anne de Bourgh.
Well, she's abominably rude to keep Charlotte out of doors in all this wind.
What a little creature she is.
I like her appearance. She looks sickly and cross. Yes, she will do very well. She will make him a proper wife.
Who, Lizzie?
Charlotte, Maria, Sir William, Elizabeth and Mr. Collins are walking down a pebbled path towards Rosings.
There are 32 gardeners. Mark the windows. There are 64 in all. 64! And I have it on good authority that the glazing alone costs in excess of £600.
It is a very handsome building and prettily situated, sir, and by no means lacking in windows.
Elizabeth reaches up to touch her bonnet.
Oh, no, do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Lady Catherine is far from requiring that elegance of dress in us which becomes herself and her daughter. You will not think the worse of you for being simply dressed. She likes to have the distinction of rank preserved.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. That is a great comfort.
An apothecary will serve your needs quite adequately. And make sure it be no one but Nicholson, Mrs. Collins. I shall be extremely angry if I hear that you have gone elsewhere.
I assure you, I have no intention to, Lady Catherine.
No, indeed, no intention at all.
Well,
Miss Anne, Mrs. Jenkinson, Charlotte and Mr. Collins sit on the couch to Lady Catherine's right, while Sir William, Elizabeth and Maria sit on the couch to her left. Lady Catherine sits in her chair like it's a throne, and she is holding court.
your friend appears to be quite a genteel, pretty sort of gal, Mrs. Collins. Her father's estate is entailed on Mr. Collins, I understand.
Yes, ma'am, and I am, believe me...
Do you have brothers and sisters, Miss Bennet?
Yes, ma'am. I'm the second of 5 sisters.
Are any of your younger sister out?
Yes, ma'am, all of them.
All? What, all 5 out at once? The younger ones out before the older are married? Your younger sisters must be very young.
Yes, ma'am. My youngest is not 16.
Oh.
She is full young to be out much in company, but really, ma'am, I think it would be very hard upon younger sisters that they not have their share of society and amusement, simply because their elder sisters have not the means or the inclination to marry early. Sir William, wouldn't you agree?
You give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. Pray, what is your age?
With 3 younger sisters grown up, your ladyship can hardly expect me to own it.
Miss Bennet, you cannot be more than 20, I am sure. Therefore, there is no need to conceal your age.
I am not 21.
Mrs. Collins, did I tell your Lady Betcoff's calling on me yesterday to thank me for sending her Miss Pope? Lady Catherine, said she, you have given me a treasure. Yes. Yes.
Elizabeth, Charlotte and Maria walk down a road.
It is beautiful. I think I could grow almost as fond of these woods and hills as you have, Charlotte.
Lizzie, we have been here 3 weeks and already we have dined at Rosings Park 6 times. I would never have expected it to be so many.
No, nor I.
My dear! Maria! Cousin Elizabeth!
Mr. Collins runs weakly towards them, waving his hat and panting.
Mr. Darcy has arrived at Rosings, and with him his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, the youngest son of the Earl of Matlock. And the gentlemen have vouchsafed us the greatest honour. They are coming to call on us at the parsonage.
When, my dear?
Even now, Mrs. Collins, even now they are hard on my heels. Make haste, make haste.
I think this must be due to you, Lizzie. Mr. Darcy would never have come so soon to wait upon me.
You are mistaken, Charlotte, for I know he dislikes me as much as I do him.
Oh, make haste, make haste.
Colonel Fitzwilliam sits down across from Elizabeth in the parlour.
I am delighted to make your acquaintance at last, Miss Bennet.
At last, sir.
Well, I have heard much of you, and none of the praise has been exaggerated, I assure you.
Oh, well, I can well believe that. Mr. Darcy is my severest critic.
Elizabeth notices Darcy watching her.
I hope we shall see you frequently while we're at Rosings. I am fond of lively conversation.
Well, this you do not find at Rosings Park?
Mr. Collins is talking to Mr. Darcy, whom Darcy ignores. But when Charlotte speaks to him, Darcy looks at her and gives her a polite nod before going back to watching Elizabeth.
Well, my aunt does talk a great deal, but seldom requires a response. My friend there hardly speaks a word when he comes to Kent, though he is lively enough in other places. Nobody sings, nobody plays. I believe you play and sing, Miss Bennet.
Oh, a little, and very ill. I wouldn't wish to excite your anticipation.
Oh, I'm sure you're too modest, but any relief would be profoundly welcome, I assure you.
Can you tell me why Mr. Darcy keeps staring at me? What do you think offends him?
Fitzwilliam and Elizabeth look over at Darcy as he stands up and walks over to them. The room goes silent as he passes.
I hope your family is in good health.
I thank you, yes.
There is a silent pause as Darcy continues looking at Elizabeth, and Colonel Fitzwilliam casually shifts his gaze from Darcy to Elizabeth.
My sister has been in town these 3 months. Have you never happened to see her?
No, I have not had that pleasure.
Everyone watches him walk to the window, hands clasped behind his back. The Colonel turns back to Elizabeth, who tilts her head.
Mr. Darcy and I, you see, are not the best of friends.
Well, I'm very surprised to hear that.
Why should you be? I always believe in first impressions, and his good opinion, once lost, is lost forever.
Darcy turns to look at her. Elizabeth smiles at the Colonel.
So you see, it is a hopeless case, is it not, Colonel Fitzwilliam?
Colonel Fitzwilliam smiles at Elizabeth, and his shoulders shake with silent laughter. Darcy turns back to the window. That evening, Elizabeth plays moderately well on the piano. Colonel Fitzwilliam sits next to her, leaning on the edge of the piano, and Lady Catherine, Darcy, Charlotte, Maria, Miss Anne, Mrs. Jenkinson and Mr. Collins listen to her playing in the next room. Elizabeth finishes the song.
You will never play really well, Miss Bennet, unless you practice more. You may come to Rosings as often as you like and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkinson's room. She would be in nobody's way in that part of the house.
Thank you, ma'am.
There are a few people in England, I suppose.
Seemingly annoyed, Mr. Darcy gets up and walks into the piano room.
Who have more true enjoyment in music than myself, or a better taste. And if I had ever learned, I should be a true proficient. And so would Anne.
Elizabeth continues to tinker as Mr. Darcy stands over her.
Do you mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me? But I won't be alarmed. My courage rises with every attempt to intimidate me.
I know you find great enjoyment in professing opinions which are not your own.
Your cousin would teach you not to believe a word I say, Colonel Fitzwilliam. That is ungenerous of him, is it not?
It is indeed, Darcy.
In politic, too, for it provokes me to retaliate and say somewhat of his behaviour in Hertfordshire, which may shock his relations.
I'm not afraid.
What have you to accuse him of? I should dearly like to know how he behaves among strangers.
First time ever I saw Mr. Darcy was at a ball, where he danced only 4 dancers, though gentlemen were scarce, and more than one lady was in want of a partner.
Darcy stands uncomfortable, pondering her statement.
I'm sorry to pain you, but so it was.
I can well believe it.
I fear I am ill-equipped to recommend myself to strangers.
Shall we ask him why? Why a man of sense and education, who has lived in the world, should be ill-equipped to recommend himself to strangers?
I have not that talent which some possess of conversing easily with strangers.
Well, I do not play this instrument so well as I should wish to, but I have always supposed that to be my own fault, because I would not take the trouble of practicing.
You are perfectly right. You have employed your time much better. No one admitted to the privilege of hearing you could think anything wanting. We, neither of us, perform to strangers.
Darcy and Elizabeth continue regarding one another.
What are you talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? I must have my share in the conversation.
The following day, Elizabeth writes a letter to Jane.
As for the daughter, she is a pale, sickly creature with little conversation and no talent. I'm sorry to be hard on any of our sex, but there it is. Mr. Darcy shows no inclination for her and treats her with the same contemptuous indifference that he shows to everyone. But Lady Catherine is clearly determined to have him for a son-in-law, and she is not a woman to be gainsaid.
Elizabeth puts down her pen and waves the paper to dry the ink before putting it at the bottom of a pile of stationery. A servant opens the door and Darcy enters.
Mr. Darcy?
Darcy bows and Elizabeth nods to him.
Mrs. Collins and Maria are just now gone into Hunsford Village with my cousin. You find me alone this morning, Mr. Darcy?
No, I beg your pardon. I would not wish to intrude upon your privacy.
I was just writing a letter to my sister Jane in London, that's all.
Ah.
Mr. Bingley and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?
Perfectly so, I thank you.
I understand Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield?
It is probable that he may spend very little time there in the future.
If he means to be there but little, it would be better for the neighbourhood that he should give up the place entirely.
I should not be surprised if he were to give it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers. This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford.
I believe she did. I'm sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on more grateful recipients.
Mr. Collins appears extremely fortunate in his choice of wife.
Yes, indeed he is. Though, seen in a prudential light, it is a good match for her as well.
It must be very agreeable for her to be settled within so easy a distance of her family.
Easy distance, do you call it? It's nearly 50 miles.
What is 50 miles of good road? Yes, I call it very easy distance.
Oh, near and far are relative terms. Well, it is possible for a woman to be settled too near her family.
Yes, exactly. You would not wish to be always near Longbourn, I think. I shall trespass on your time no longer. Please convey my regards to Mrs. Collins and her sister. Please, do not trouble yourself.
Darcy turns and leaves, shutting the door behind him. Elizabeth reflects on his visit, still confused. Elizabeth walks around Rosings Park, enjoying the gardens.
Miss Bennet.
The Colonel walks towards her, removing his hat in salutation.
Colonel Fitzwilliam.
I've been making the tour of the park as I do every year. Shall we take this way together?
With pleasure.
Elizabeth and Fitzwilliam begin walking.
Do you know Mr. Bingley and his sisters?
Knew them a little. Bingley is a pleasant, gentleman-like man. He's a great friend of Darcy's.
Oh, yes. Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley and takes a prodigious deal of care of him.
Oh, yes, I believe Darcy does take a great care of him. I understand that he congratulates himself on having lately saved Mr. Bingley the inconvenience of a most imprudent marriage.
Did Mr. Darcy give his reason for this interference?
I understand there were some very strong objections to the lady.
And why was he to be the judge?
You are disposed to think his interference officious?
Well, I do not see what right Mr. Darcy had to determine and direct in what manner his friend was to be happy. But as you say, we know none of the particulars. Perhaps there was not much affection in this case.
Perhaps not. But if that were the case, it would lessen the honour of my cousin's triumph very sadly, don't you think? Oh, Miss Bennet, are you unwell?
A sudden headache. Perhaps I've walked too far today.
Let us take the shorter way back.
Colonel Fitzwilliam offers Elizabeth his arm. She takes it and they walk back the way they came. Later, Elizabeth sits on a chair in the front hall of the parsonage, while Maria, Mr. Collins and Charlotte appear to depart for Rosings.
You're sure, Lizzie? Because I would willingly stay at home with you and brave all Lady Catherine's displeasure.
My dear Charlotte, I beg you to
I shall be quite all right. It's only a headache, it will pass, and I'm sure more speedy in quiet and solitude.
And I am quite sure, when all the circumstances are fully explained to Lady Catherine, she will not be angry, for she has indeed such Christian generosity of spirit.
My dear, the time.
Oh, my dear, why did you not say so before? I cannot begin to count the occasions on which her ladyship has impressed upon me the sovereign importance of punctuality.
Elizabeth closes her eyes as they leave and slowly walks into the next room. She sits in a chair in the parlour looking at some letters. When the bell rings, she stands. The servant opens the door for Mr. Darcy, who bows quickly.
Forgive me. I hope you're feeling better.
I am, thank you. Will you not sit down?
Elizabeth sits in a chair, and Mr. Darcy uncomfortably looks at her, walks towards her, then turns and goes back to the mirror. Darcy turns to face her, and then sits in a chair, placing his hat on the table. He folds his hands and looks at her. Elizabeth looks confused and curious. Darcy stands and walks to the corner before finally approaching her.
In vain I have struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. In declaring myself thus, I am fully aware that I will be going expressly against the wishes of my family, my friends, and I hardly need add my own better judgment. The relative situation of our families is such that any alliance between us must be regarded as a highly reprehensible connection. Indeed, as a rational man, I cannot but regard it as such myself. But it cannot be helped. Almost from the earliest moments of our acquaintance, I have come to feel for you a passionate admiration and regard which, despite all my struggles, has overcome every rational objection. And I beg you, most fervently, to relieve my suffering and consent to be my wife.
In such cases as these, I believe the established mode is to express a sense of obligation. But I cannot. I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I'm sorry to cause pain to anyone, but it was most unconsciously done, and I hope it will be of short duration.
And this is all the reply I am to expect. I might wonder why, with so little effort at civility, I am rejected.
And I might wonder why, with so evident a desire to offend and insult me, you chose to tell me that you like me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character. Was this not some excuse for incivility if I was uncivil? I have every reason in the world to think ill of you. Do you think any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining the happiness of a most beloved sister? Can you deny that you have done it?
I have no wish to deny it. I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, and I rejoice in my success. Towards him, I have been kinder than towards myself.
But it is not merely that on which my dislike of you is founded. Long before it had taken place, my dislike for you was decided when I heard Mr. Wickham's story of your dealings with him. How can you defend yourself on that subject?
And you take an eager interest in that gentleman's concerns.
Who that knows what his misfortunes have been could help feeling an interest in him?
His misfortunes, yes, his misfortunes have been great indeed.
And of your infliction. You have reduced him to his present state of poverty, and yet you can treat his misfortunes with contempt and ridicule.
And this is your opinion of me. My faults by this calculation are heavy indeed. But perhaps these offences might have been overlooked had not your pride been hurt by the honest confession of the scruples which have long prevented my forming any serious design on you. Yet had I concealed my struggles and flattered you. A disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. Nor am I ashamed of the feelings I related. They were natural and just. Did you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections? To congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly below my own?
You're mistaken, Mr. Darcy. The mode of your declaration merely spared me any concern I might have felt in refusing you had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. From the very beginning, your manners impressed me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain for the feelings of others. I had not known you a month before I felt you were the very last man in the world whom I could ever marry.
You have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and now have only to be ashamed of what mine own have been. Please forgive me for having taken up your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness.
Darcy bows and leaves without looking back.